Um, it takes a lot of time. I'm going and jumping from one tafsir to another. I don't think there was any class that I spent this much, and this amount of time in preparation, in I guess in doing the research, all of that, especially when you're every single day is a new class. Every single day is a new subject because of the ayat, etc. And you don't want to just depend on one resource. You want to make sure, you're doing the different let's say research for tafsir, in where I'm going to multiple tafsir, not just one. And subhanAllah, I am benefiting a lot. Even those names, and it's so fun to even research a lot of those names that you had known about before, but it just comes in, and where you're like, well, I really want to know more. The question just pops up. So you start searching again and researching again and all of that. And yesterday I was reading about Abu Ali al-Jubba'i,
Mhm.
and it was quite interesting. We're going to come across Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. It was quite interesting how you would come across certain figures. They would have a certain thing in history that, even though, despite their ilm, despite their knowledge, despite their position, so Abu Ali al-Jubba'i was actually known to being a Mu'tazili that was considered a very important figure in at least the Mu'tazila. He was considered a very important person, in where, of course, later on, you could see, I mean, let's look him up a little bit. um, in where, let's look at that, and where he was following this bid'ah, but he was mutawassi'an fil ilm. He was very extensive in his research, in his knowledge. Sayyal al-dhihn. The we describe him as Sayyal al-dhihn. It's like his mind would be pouring with knowledge. And where you could see dhallal al-kalama wa sahala. When he would speak with such high eloquence and such simplicity, in where the hardest things would become so easy for him. But here's one thing, in where, there's a Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, of course, his mother married Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. So al-Ash'ari, Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, before, when he was a child, his mother, of course, got divorced from his father, or was it got divorced, or got widowed? I can't remember exactly, but of course, Abu Ali al-Jubba'i becomes his stepfather at the end. And Abu Hassan Ash'ari, of course, he's getting his education, but still, clearly and obviously, there was this hidden strong woman that was in the background. I guess that wasn't exposed, obviously. Why would Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, who is this exceptionally smart person, actually get married to his mother? And at the same time, this young boy later on becomes a major figure in Islam. Anyhow, so then, of course, Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, he was part of the Mu'tazila, and they actually adhere to the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will goes beyond, in where you don't even have a choice to make. He only wills what is good, and therefore there's no will of your will. You don't have free will. No, you are forced into a certain will, which is Allah's will, that goes before you and goes and is applied onto you. And it's always going to be a good will, anyways. So, but that's not what Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, that's not what he believed. So, of course, he said, let just a hypothetical question. We have three brothers. One brother is a religious person, prays, fasts, does everything that needs to be done. He's got another brother that's not a believer at all. In fact, he's a believer, he's a sinner, that's it. The third brother died as a young boy. So his response was, well, the first one is going to go to Jannah, anyways, he's been doing his homework, he's religious, he's going to go to Jannah. The second one is going to be going to hellfire. Why? Well, because he didn't invest for it. The third one is going to be from Ahl Salama. In other words, he's going to go to Jannah. And then he asked him, well, what if we were to say that the third one, you said he's going to be in Jannah, right? He said, yes. He said, is he going to be at the same level as the first one of those brothers? He said, no. Why not? Because this one had actually invested a lot of action. He said, fair enough. But he could say and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, why can't you put me in my first brother's position? If you would have given me time, I would have probably made it. I would have made it and I would have been at that good. And then if you were to say that Allah's power goes beyond and therefore his will goes beyond all and etc., then it would actually mean that this young child could say, well, that's not fair. You didn't give me the time. You made me die as a young child. That's not fair. If you would have given me enough time, I would have actually been this guy. And the second brother can say, well, instead of, why did you put me in hellfire? Well, you did the wrong things. You chose to do the wrong things, and therefore you belonged in hellfire. He could have said, well, you could have made me die when I was a child. I would have made it. Right? So that made Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, you know, I guess, go over his ideas in regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really forcing you into a certain will, and you don't have the right to free will. And of course, later he adopted Ahmad ibn Hanbal's ideas in Aqidah, which is pretty much the Tawheed that we're studying in our classes. So just just an idea in where it's Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And you could see, just Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, and where what we will come across, and where al-Qurtubi, and oftentimes he would say, Abu Ali said this, Abu Ali said this. And I want you to keep in mind when you see a lot of the scholars that al-Qurtubi would quote, just keep in mind that those are the figures that really stood out even in Islamic history. So Ibn Khuwaizim and Dad, I guess when we're speaking about perhaps Malik, Shafi'i, etc., you could see that we're really coming across pretty much the same names every single time. I mean, right now, I actually prepared, so we're almost done with our seventh volume in Tafsir al-Qurtubi. We're going to the eighth volume, and we're actually seeing that pretty much the same names are actually being quoted by al-Qurtubi, pretty much the same names. Very rarely did we come up with names that we didn't mention before, and whenever we would, speak about them, we might sometimes say, hey, we're going to research that name and we'll talk about that. So whether we're speaking about Qatada, al-Qushayri, al-Hasan, we're speaking about the same names on and on, because they're being quoted as why? Well, because they're important figures in Islamic history. They were the ones that had the most weight, let's call it that way. They had the most weight, they had the most importance. So inshallah, yeah, we were just having a conversation, but let's start inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And inshallah, we will be starting our tafsir again. And inshallah, to continue, yesterday we were doing سماعون للكذب. We did this portion of it, and now we're jumping onto this one. But let's go over really quick what of for in of what we did yesterday. سماعون للكذب, we said they were constantly listening to, of course, sentences, words of fabrications, words of fakeness that basically resulted in living a life of fakeness, where they'll put their interest before other people's interest as well, and they're willing to let their own interest basically control their principle and not necessarily the principle ruling. So it's not the principle that rules, but it's actually their interest that rules. And of course, with people like that, you could never expect them to stay within principle, but they will always betray you at the end. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling فَإِن جَاءُوكَ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ أَوْ أَعْرَضْ عَنْهُم. So if they would come to you, either judge and rule between them or turn them away. When we're talking about turn them away, so then we went in details in the debate on whether we are supposed to, if we're talking about Islamic governance, on whether we're supposed to be ruling within, of course, our country on those that are not Muslim, that is Ahl al-Dhimma, whether we're going to be using, let's call it the Islamic justice system, whether we're speaking about family laws or whether we're speaking about criminal laws or whether we're speaking about, I guess, when we're talking about transactions, civil laws, all these different areas, are we going to be using the Islamic justice system or are we going to have them use their own? So that was the debate where you had the famous opinion, Maliki, that no, it's going to be one justice system. It's going to be the Islamic ruling, and it's going to be applied on everybody, every citizen, regardless of their faith. That's going to be basically the Muslim constitution. Yet the Hanafi was different. For the Hanafi, they considered that no, it's important to have them consent to it. So if they consent to the Islamic justice system, well, then we'll basically use that and have them rule by that. But if they wanted to use their own justice system, well, they could just use their own justice system. After all, they basically depended on this ayah, أو أعرض عنهم, in where we don't necessarily have to go and rule on them, and we could just have them have their own family court, their own civil court, and not necessarily something that was related to us. So it's really important. I mean, even if you were to, I'm actually pro Maliki madhab in this regards. The reason why, because when you're talking about any justice system, there's no way that any court can have any power unless there was some force that was making whatever this court rules in of any worth. So if you're looking at the Muslims within the US, for example, إن الله لا يزع بالسلطان ما لا يزع بالقرآن. Uthman bin Affan said, what did he say? He said, quote, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the power in the authority in a power that you will not even find in the Quran. What is it? I mean, so you're having the authority itself. You're having the government itself have some law enforcement, some power. And of course, you can't necessarily just expect people to abide by the Quran unless you really had some power that's going to say, hey, you don't follow this. This is how we're going to deal with you. So even if it's the Quran, it's not enough to just say, yes, we're bringing in a good inspiration. We've got good mawa'ath right there. We're just going to let everybody be inspired by the good, kind words and all of that. But no, you will see that there's going to be the power of law, the power of sultan, government, even more powerful in its application than the words of inspiration in the Quran, which is absolutely true. You have to have power. I mean, even when you see the Muslims in the US, for example, you would have a Muslim husband and wife, they would come in and say, hey, when they would be the ones to actually come in of course the masjid and ask to rule in of course in Islam and by Islam and all of that. But then if let's say we would say, hey, this is what you owe to the man or even to the wife, we would say that they would not actually abide by it. You would see that they would just turn their backs, and then it becomes, if the woman didn't like the ruling, she'll say, hey, that's not what I know, that's not what I heard, and therefore we'll just walk away. And if the man didn't want to apply any of that, and the woman was actually a victim, and if he didn't want to apply anything to him, you know what? أعلى ما في خيلك اركب. Go ahead. We're not going to give you anything, and let's see what you could do about it. I don't believe in that, or okay, I believe in it, but guess what? I'm not going to apply. Is the sheikh going to have any power to enforce and to force the man to take the words that he basically made as a final judgment into action? The answer is no. They don't have any power. And that's the thing, is that at the end, when you want to rule in any group of people, it's very important to consider and understand that power and law enforcement, and of course, we're talking about police as well, to make sure that such rules are applied and such governance is basically bringing in the stability within the society. Because if you're talking about any part and any piece of the society, whether they're a minority, a religious minority or not, any group of people that they're basically going into some form of instability, at the end, it's going to start affecting the bigger group, which basically is in this situation like the Muslim community, without you realizing. So that's why I am actually pro the Maliki madhab, although it may sound like it's very democratic, it's very tolerant of other people's faiths, to take and adopt the Hanafi madhab, in where allowing people to rule on their own, etc. But I am pro Maliki because we cannot have any part of the society that's living without, let's say, stability within their system or within the society. We have to have one rule, one law, and we're making sure that everybody applies it, making sure that there is a constitution in where bringing in the society together. After all, you would be contradicting yourself if you're a Muslim government or any government, let's say in America or even in the West, you could see that they don't have a special law and say, yeah, well, for the Muslims, yeah, we acknowledge and we understand that you've got your own rules, you've got your own Sharia laws, and we're going to allow you to apply it. Absolutely not. They're not going to say that, and they'd be contradicting themselves as if they said that too. Because if they regard, and if you as a Muslim, same
Oh yeah,
thing,
that's true.
they're
SubhanAllah.
not going to, there's no way. If you regard that this is the fair justice system, then to let someone else apply something else, then that means this is a possibility that there's going to be a new governance that is within your governance. There's going to be a new governance, something that is going to go against your own judicial system. Simple as that. If it's going against your own judicial system, that means they're going against your own autonomy. Later on, they can claim their own city, they can claim their own country, later on, it will basically become something that will be considered a form of separation and division within the society. And without you realizing, they're going to form their own country. All right. Well, that's not only in the American system, but that's in the West. And that's the same way that Muslim would think. If I'm going to have any group of people basically create their own justice system, that actually means they're going to become divided from the main thing. And as any country, so here we go. Let's say the Muslims, you believe that Islam's Sharia law is basically justice, then it would be self-contradictory if you were going to apply a new order, a new law, and you're going to consider that, yes, I'm going to accept other people to take it. I'm going to accept that other people would apply a different law. That means you're accepting injustice. I thought you said it was called injustice. Why are you accepting it? when in Islam, you're supposed to rule by justice. So why did you not rule by justice within your constitution if you're going to take that? Same thing if you were to look at, for example, the West. Would they allow you to practice, for example, something as simple as polygamy? They won't allow you to practice it. Why? Because even though they're allowing, same sex, they're allowing all these different kinds, and soon you're going to see pedophilia, you're going to see all those things going to the surface. Why not polygamy? Why polygamy? Why is that out of all the different sexual ways, why polygamy is the only thing that they would consider themselves as no? This is an antagonist type of culture. So it actually goes back historically. It goes back, one, you had Saint Augustine. Okay, that was the first thing. Saint Augustine actually ended polygamy, even though it was actually part of the culture. It was part of the culture. We're talking about the Greek, and we're talking about the Roman Empire. It was actually widely practiced. Hey, even the Bible. Even the Bible was telling us that King Solomon actually had 700, according to the Bible in the Old Testament, and you had so many different. And where even in the Gospel of Matthew's, Prophet Jesus comes across this guy was actually married to 18 women and another guy. So you could see all these different texts in where in the Old Testament and the New Testament that polygamy was actually widely practiced, and there was no text to actually say that it is against the law of at least the children of Israel or even the law of God. But it wasn't until St. Augustine, of course, rules, and when he basically, of course, becomes the person to determine a lot of what we see in Christianity today. And of course, he wanted to make sure, because the noble people, of course, if you had the money, if you're a man, you had the money, you were going to marry multiple women. To marry multiple women actually means to have the class divided. What does that mean? So we're talking about a person that is considered noble marrying four women as well, because he needed more women. And the noble women are going to be limited, and certainly not probably taking the different qualities that perhaps somebody that is considered a poor class. But hey, to bring her in, that was actually meaning that we're bringing in the lower class right now within the upper class. So, in order to make a noble group and divide, make sure that they're divided and separated away from the lower class, or at least, of course, the peasants, it was important to make sure that we're putting an end to the noble people from expanding their area, and bringing in the peasants, and bringing in, of course, the lower class, and bringing them in to share this wealth. Now, the best thing to do is make polygamy illegal. So the main reason was really, was really, it was really individualism. It was really just I guess selfishness, in where, yeah, we just got to make sure that we keep this lower class, these laborers, actually stay as laborers, as our slaves. We got to make sure that they don't join and they don't share this wealth with us. And the best way to do this is by making sure that even the nobles would never expand in their, let's call it the family, I guess, the family relations, because once they get married to somebody, well, then they would feel that they owe them something. They would have a relationship. In other words, you're expanding the area. You're expanding the area of relationship. You're expanding the area of wealth distribution. You're expanding the area of not only wealth distribution, but this wealth distribution later becomes a distribution of autonomy, a distribution of authority. You're expanding the area. Well, we're not going to be noble anymore. So that's what happened. So it was time to end it. But if you were to go farther in history, you didn't say that all Christians necessarily accepted this type of I guess fatwa, all right? And you had different kings, even in the West, practice polygamy. But it wasn't until later. Now, here's one thing. When you look at the whole thing about West, how do we understand West? What makes West? What is the West? So when is Russia West? No, it's not. Well, why isn't it? Why isn't Russia West? They're blonde and blue-eyed and tall. They could fit within at least the Aryan race. Why aren't they the West? And why is Russia not even part of the NATO? Why does America consider itself the West, even though it's a completely different area? So what makes the West, consider themselves as one body, even though when you look at, for example, the Latinos or Latin America, it's even though it's a Christian group, but it doesn't consider it's not considered the West, even though it's Christian. So one thing is that the West considers themselves the West because they go back one, you've got one Christian group, two, Greek and Roman heritage. Okay, the Greek and Roman heritage that created this common, I guess, background, even though their languages are actually different. But that, and of course, you had the Germans and the French who were always at each other's throats, and certainly of course, the Irish and the Brits and all of that. Until now, the Irish would consider themselves as really colonized by the Brits, and you could say throughout history, and where there was this this battle that was always bloody. You're talking about more than 70 million were actually killed in Europe. Just imagine that. 70 million. I mean, throughout the bloodiest times in Muslim history, we didn't actually fight as Muslims. I mean, yeah, we had our bloody moments in where, whether you're talking about, I guess, the Umayyad and the Abbasid and all of that, we didn't reach the number. We didn't reach at all the number of casualties that happened in Europe, not even close. Uh, the Muslims never actually got that far. Okay. But you could see right now the West is united and the Muslims can't even unite, not even in the Middle East. Not even in the Middle East. We can't even unite. What happened? You know, and when you look at, so let's go back to the part of what makes the West. So you've got, okay, Australia is considered part of the West when it's this faraway island where no man has gone before. And well, now of course they took over the indigenous peoples. What are they called? At least they wanted to portray it that there was no man that went there before. And of course, the indigenous people, they kept on doing the same thing that even the Europeans had done to American, to the Native Americans, of course, they refused the word Native Americans, but let's say the natives, okay, the natives of and the indigenous people of the Americas. And of course, you can see in where Australia is considered part of the West, and even though it's really far away. So in other words, it's not a geographical what is the word, classification. It's more of a heritage. It's more of a cultural classification. So why isn't Russia part of that? Well, Russia is generally one in where you've got Russia is basically two parts, in where you've got the Euro side of it, and you've got the other side, which is Asian side. So you've got the Asian side in where some, like Siberia, they would actually look Chinese, even though it's considered the biggest area in Russia. I mean, only 800 people live there, but it's the biggest area. Why only 800 people? Because it's just, you're talking about 80 degrees, 80 below. Who's going to be capable of living in such a terrain? Only 800 people managed to do it. And um, and you just gotta put that within the context of what we understand. So Moscow is not necessarily the only area, but yes, it's probably the most area. But even in Moscow, you're going to be having different groups. Some of it, they're going to look like Uzbek and going to look like Kazakh, where they look pretty Asian, small eyes, round faces, Tatar, they look very different. And you've got like the Gorbachev and or even Putin and where blonde and very fond of his blondness. And he would say, well, no, we're not Europe. We're actually coming from a completely different group of people. And of course, he's putting in and we're trying to expand and trying to trying to fight even the West. I know we're speaking about a completely different thing, but I think it's important it's important to understand those areas in where even when we're speaking about the peace in where what actually makes one body. So when we're going back, we cannot bring about any understanding even in Sharia. All right. In Sharia, there is a law in oh dear. There is a law in where it says al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. Let me write that down. What is al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi? Al-hukm, let me write that down. In where al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. When you speak about, what does that mean? When you want to speak about any matter, it's really important to basically envision it. Have a complete vision, a complete understanding, a complete study before you would basically make a final statement in that regards. So when we're speaking about, for example, we're speaking about constitution, we're speaking about governance, we're speaking about political science, we cannot just speak of the text and not put it within the lens of all the different information that is key to understanding how as a Muslim community, we would need to also keep in consideration the different lessons that we could learn from the different things in history. So when we're speaking about, for example, we're speaking about Russia, we're speaking about right now the West, etc. It's really important to have this awareness in order to understand what, especially when you're probably invited as a speaker. There's some information that we need to put it within the context and understand that if we are to defend an idea that, yes, we're going to have a minority that's applying something else, what you're really going to be missing out is not understanding that whenever you would have any group of people living within your country, have their own culture, have their own, at least judicial system, you're basically making the main ingredient for a future division, for a future body that will start to now or later ask for its own independence. That's what even happened when you're looking at, for example, Russia. It's not part of the West because it basically is considered, hey, we're Orthodox. We've got a lot of people that are not necessarily European looking, but they're not part of the Aryan race. They're more Asian race than anything else. So in order to create this body We need to make sure that we're creating a new identity for ourselves. Same thing when you look at South America. South America has its, yes, it's Christian, but they consider that one, they're Catholics, two, that they don't belong to the Greek and the Roman Empire. They don't consider themselves part of Europe, and even Europe doesn't consider them, or the West doesn't consider that Latin America is part of them. They've got, of course, their own group. So now that's where you would see Latin America, Africa, and here's the thing. So is Africa part of the East or the West? There was a very interesting study. It was maybe I can show it to you. And this study, let's see, I'm going to show it to you. And he was a professor in Cambridge University. Let's see, good Muslim, bad Muslim. I know this is the book. And it was Mahmoud Mamdani. Okay, he's Muslim, originally from, I absolutely love this book. It's called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And what he does in where he talks about how is it, are you capable of seeing what I'm doing? Yes. He talks about how the West had basically divided a certain classification in where there's a good Muslim that they would consider that this is what a good Muslim would look like, and this is what a bad Muslim would look like. And of course, it's not necessarily based on a good Muslim to be practicing Islam and not sinning much, but it basically would be based on the classification that you adhere to our liberal culture, then therefore you're a good Muslim. If you don't adhere to our Western culture, then therefore you're a bad Muslim. And he also talks about one thing that's very important in where this classification of East and West. And of course, if we're dividing this East and West, and always the friction between the East and the West was always coming in as, well, that means there's no other group. So when you're talking about East and West, that means, of course, you're taking out, of course, East would be, okay, well, how far is East? You cannot, if you're going to consider East to be the Orient, to be, of course, the Muslim countries, well, China is part of the East. Are you going to consider that Muslim? India is not part of the East. They've got their own religions, their own set of cultures. It's a very, very complex place that you cannot consider that as Muslim. But of course, the West, and where West to whom? So he was saying how the division of, or this classification of East and West was actually coming from the West itself, in where they regarded themselves West, and that the others, all of them, are East, in where that's where the Western resources are needed to be found in. That's where those areas are basically somewhat a rival. They're a rival in where the East and the West. But here's one thing. There's one very important thing that is completely outside of this classification. Africa, Latin America, completely out of this classification. Why? And he says that the reason why it was made to be out of completely the classification, in fact, even the map was made to seem like Africa was this small continent, and that, of course, Iceland was this huge place, and Europe was even bigger than the Middle East and all of that. And he was saying, well, even though in reality, geographically speaking, that's not true, but it was made to be seen that way for imperialist reasons. The imperialist reason was to make Africa seem like they are basically subhuman, that they are not to even be included within this whole world because they are basically nothing to be considered. And therefore, they're resources not for the Africans, but they're actually resources for the West to basically use, but it was basically finding the rival slash East right now needing to fight. So the best way to deal with the rival East is to colonize them. Whether we're speaking about the Muslim world or whether we're speaking about a country like India, it was time to, hey, let's colonize those countries. And it was really interesting. I was yesterday all the time I was you could see I'm still living in that lecture. I was listening to this lecture. Let me see if I can actually show it to you. Where is it? Where was it? It was let me see the history, and we'll see that lecture right there. This one. And it's really important to listen to this lecture because when we're speaking about the Muslim countries, why are they divided? Why is the Muslim world divided? And how did the let's say the European countries or the so-called West is actually united? Can you see what I'm sharing? And he did an outstanding job in breaking it down. I know it's like 2 hours and 11 minutes. You can actually put captions and you can even put translations, and it's really important to listen to this lecture. This guy's from Mauritania, political scientist, and also is, I would say, he even memorized the Quran, mashallah. So he definitely is I guess let's just call it Ikhwan slash an Islamist. All right, let's say it that way. Whatever that means, and where their classification, at least in the Western classification, just wanted to mention this one, in where to listen to this lecture sometimes is to help us understand the challenges that the Muslims are facing and what do we have to do in order to bring about this unity? How do we understand and benefit from the situation that we're in? Okay, now going back to the good Muslim and bad Muslim, Mahmoud Mamdani, he was also talking about how such a division in where East and West and leaving out Africa was really in order to consider some certain groups of people as not existent. And where all Africa is not existent, it's nothing to even be considered, and therefore the resources, as if it's really only to be used by Western the West, or those that are considered as the final evolution of man. What does evolution have to do with this? So he was also talking about um, how the Darwin theory, even in the classification in where considered that man used to be African and was an ape, and then later evolved into, I guess, being something that looks like an ape, basically an African, and that's why they were Africans. But then, of course, from an African, which basically is supposed to be the earliest stage of man, in where they didn't have the same intelligence, they didn't have the same features of human beings, because they were to be considered as African, in where they're nearer to the line, the line in the chain of development of human beings. They're nearer to the line of apes than actually the line of human development. So just think of that line, that chain, let's look at it here, evolution theory. Maybe we could write it right there, evolution theory, and here we go. Let's write it right there. Okay. And of course, considering that, this is when we're speaking about these stages, they were really happening in Africa. And of course, the farther they would go in their stages of development, where did they go? Where they started developing new features. They started basically growing. And that's how, of course, the more developed they are, the wider they got. Okay, the more developed they are, the wider they got. And of course, the wider they got, the more developed in where the whole idea, it's the survival of the fittest. So who is the fittest? Well, the fittest is going to be white. The fittest is going to be smarter, meaning white. The fittest is going to be more powerful, meaning white. Then therefore, the black, they cannot survive without the white interference. White intervention, white interference, and therefore even the resources, they're incapable, the Africans are incapable of using these resources because they didn't develop the necessary features, the necessary human features, and therefore all they need to be and all they're capable of doing is really nothing but being under the white power. So of
This is
course,
so crazy.
it's so
Everything you're saying is like psychotic.
exactly.
Whoever said this stuff.
Well, I mean, so he was breaking it down. So one thing you want to keep in mind is that Mahmoud Mamdani, he actually is specialized in studying the psychology of sociology. That's a really interesting field. You know, the psychology of sociology is like, what is that? And you never hear of that, but it's really interesting of how he breaks it down. Does an outstanding job, breaking it down. It's like, okay, how did they how did they actually think that these people are incapable? Well, that's the same thing. Of course, when you're talking about the Muslim countries, well, they're brown. They're brown, and of course, generally brown. Therefore, to treat them as well on the stage of development, they're not as brown as Africans, but they're brown. Okay, therefore the way to deal with them. Okay, they're a rival. They're of course, and there was always this touch between the Muslim world and of course the West when it was actually ruling North Africa, etc. But then later on, of course, they were becoming, hey, something that you cannot whatsoever ignore. And of course, the Muslim presence was actually considered at one point nothing but a superpower, in where even the West, where Muslims went all the way and actually ruled part of Europe, in where what is today called Spain, and went as far as Austria. Austria was under Muslim rule. That's right in the heart of Europe. The Muslims actually went as far in the Battle of La Poitiers in France, in where all the way really close to where, really close to the borders of Paris. Just think of that. So you cannot whatsoever disregard that these brown people can be at least let's call them pseudo brown, because the brown people, of course, what they would consider as the very brown, meaning the Africans, but they consider these partly brown, that they basically need to be colonized. The least that we could do is colonize them and make sure that they don't grow in their power. And what made them united at one point was actually Islam. So the West, and of course the Western, and this is important in where you've got the psychology of how do we make control. And I told you about this lecture that I was listening to, where it's a documentary, a very, very, very important documentary. You really, really, really need to listen to this documentary. Everybody, take it a tafsir class, take it a aqidah class. This lecture is a aqidah class. This documentary. It's 3 hours and 54 minutes. I know some things are not appropriate in it, but you really, really, really have to watch this documentary. What does it talk about? What it talks about is really how the psychology of control, whether we're speaking about psychology of control in terms of human beings, or how this psychology and a lot of this psychotherapy was actually used, whether we're speaking about politics, or whether we're speaking about companies, or whether we're speaking about the so-called education system, and how it was basically presented that it was all neutral, when in reality there is this there are these experts of psychology that are using their knowledge about human understanding, or human, let's say, development, or human mind, in order to give such methods of control. It's very diabolical. This knowledge of what they understand about human beings, and then they're giving this information to, if it's a company, we're gonna let the company basically use this method. If it's if it's a
I think
lobby,
I've
well,
seen that before, this documentary.
you really, really need to.
It's all about psychology, right?
It's all about psychology. It's all about psychology. It's really important to watch, and you know what, Noura? You really need to have Yusuf watch this one. He's grown up now. He really needs to watch this one. And that way they could really say, is this really some conspiracy or not? What is happening? Who's actually living in our brain? And it is presented like it is somehow nothing but neutral. You're making the decision, etc. But someone out there is actually controlling our brain. I know it's completely off topic, but yeah. How did we get there? I have no idea how we got there, but anyhow. Okay, let's continue with our tafsir. I know
I was just going to ask that.
exactly. سمعون للكذب. Well, that's part of the kadhib. See, there you go. I wouldn't go too far. I didn't go too far. It was part of tafsir, where they were always making lies, creating lies. And of course, in the long run, it was really wanting to put in their interest on top of everything. Here we go. That was completely twisting everything. Everybody has. Sorry about that. فإن جاءوك فاحكم بينهم أو أعرض عنهم وإن تعرض عنهم فلن يضروك شيئا. And of course, with the part we were talking about, in where what is considered as preponderant in terms of, should we rule by the Islamic Sharia law for or on those that are not Muslim? How do we understand all of this? This is extremely important, in where, yes, considering considering the part about what makes a complete body is important. So let's not fall always for the rhetoric that is out there, in where, yes, you need to be inclusive and all of that. You need to think far ahead. And of course, this ayah, yes, there are differences of opinions, Hanafi and Maliki, differences of opinions, but I think it's very important to consider. I know Noura is not going to be put the Khalifa, maybe Umayyah will be, but not Noura.
Oh, man.
I mean, Umayyah, she's got the name for it, Noura.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, she's got, you do know that the Khalifa cannot be but Qurashi. Okay. And she's got Umayyah. I mean, yeah, she's got the name for it. She can be Qurashi. And oh, wait a minute. Why are we leaving her out? Where's Sharifa? Now, she would be the Khalifa right on the
But I
spot.
thought it couldn't be male.
Noura, we're just trying to tease you guys to wake you up,
Sorry,
Noura.
sorry.
It's not like we already have a country that's set. We're just looking for the Khalifa. All right, Noura, I'm just here trying to wake you guys all up. All right, let's continue. Yeah, so the Khalifa must be Qurashi, but yeah, and it can only be male. Hold on, let me see. Just making sure that my sound is not going up and down. I know it was going up and down. فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ. So this one also supports the Maliki, in where فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, in where what you have to rule is basically based on justice. And certainly as a Muslim, your definition of justice is Sharia law. That's your definition of justice. So therefore, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ would basically, I guess, support the opinion of Nahas in where he said, أَوْ أَعْرض عَنْهُمْ, that this is abrogated. Just this piece, just the word أَعْرض عَنْهُمْ, that it was abrogated. You see, just this little small, right there, just two words, أَعْرض عَنْهُمْ, that it was abrogated. And of course, what abrogates it, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, and what also abrogates it is basically the ayah, where was it? Where was the ayah that we were? Where was it? Where was that ayah? Where was it? It was supposed to be. We were supposed to be together on this page. See, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط. We did that one. What was ayah? Hold on, I'll take you there in order for you to see it. It was this ayah. It was.
Are we on 40?
Yeah, we are, but I'm telling you, I'm basically pointing out the ayah that in Nahas and other scholars had considered as abrogated, as the abrogating ayah for the quote, أو أعرض عنهم. And they were saying that وَأَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, that that's the abrogating piece of the other ayah, ayah 49. So we're on ayah 41, okay? We're on ayah, where was it? We're on ayah 41, or 42, and the Nahas and other scholars, they said, أَوْ أَعْرَضْ عَنْهُمْ is basically abrogated by that ayah in ayah 49. وَأَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. Okay, let's see. And also, I guess فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُم بِالْقِسْطِ would also add to the opinion that said that no, we are not to necessarily have multiple laws within our country, but it's important to govern by Islam and make that as the complete governance, even if they didn't believe in it, that's basically different than what we govern by. What they want to believe in, that's their area in where we would definitely give them the space to, I guess, make their own churches, renovate their own churches, build yeshivas, build, divinity schools, all of that. We would allow them to do it. So they would have their own nonprofit organizations and they would have their own support, and we wouldn't mess with that. In fact, the government is going to ensure that those areas are protected. Okay, whether it's a synagogue, whether it's there is rather an interesting opinion for al-Qarafi. Let me take you for al-Qarafi. Al-Qarafi, an extremely smart scholar. Al-Qarafi is probably one of the most important geniuses within Muslim history. Al-Qarafi, he was from Egypt. Okay, so this is right there. This is al-Qarafi. Well, I mean, not necessarily that, but of course, for al-Qarafi, you could see he was originally from Sanhaja, which actually means originally he wasn't Egyptian. But you want to keep in mind, he was from the Berbers in Morocco. But you want to keep in mind that the Berbers were not only in Morocco. So even in Egypt, in I think it's called what is it called? What is it called? Siwa. Siwa, they're actually Berbers. So you did have Berbers even in Egypt. You have Berbers in Libya, Berbers in Tunisia, Algeria, etc. So we're talking about somebody, I guess, but he was living in Egypt. One thing about al-Qarafi, he wrote this book, Al-Furuq. It's probably one of the most advanced books in usul al-fiqh. You read that book, trust me. I remember wanting to, I guess, challenge myself when I was an undergrad and would go over that book. Okay, I would go over this book and I could manage to only understand in 2 hours, I could only manage to understand one page. one page. I'm just going over and over the same page, trying to understand it and trying to break it down. And it was sounding like, is this even Arabic? It sounded like Chinese to me. Couldn't even understand it. And that was when I was an undergrad. And still, I do understand Arabic, but I guess it was just too advanced and too technical for me. It was just all jargons. I couldn't understand anything. Okay. But one thing is that this book, although only 4 volumes, four or 5 volumes, but of course, it's in usul al-fiqh and puts in the qawa'id fiqhiyya, puts in fiqh, and it just comes out as, a set of constitutions in where how do you make, think of it as studying jurisprudence at the deepest level, in the most advanced level. Anyhow, so Al-Qarafi was such a genius that he even made a clock, an alarm clock, and it would be, think of the alarm clocks and where, when it's time to tick, the bird would come out and it would start coming out. And he was saying, I was capable of making this alarm clock and where when it was time to basically ring, this bird would come out. And he was so sad that he couldn't make the bird say something. So he was capable of making an alarm clock, was capable of designing. So that's not only a specialist in fiqh, but that's also going to be a specialist in physics and
Is that the
math.
cuckoo clock?
That's the cuckoo clock. That's the cuckoo clock. Imagine that. You could see that the scholars in Muslim history were not only scholars in fiqh, but they were mathematicians, they were physicists, they were specialists in so many different, they were these polemic scholars, and where from all over those fields, they would basically be considered the pioneers within all of them. So that's Al-Qarafi right there. Just an idea. Anyhow, so what he was saying is that he was saying that because the Christians and the Jews are living within the Muslim government, if the Muslim government does have, let's say, money to build and help them build their schools, so we're talking about, let's say, government funding for their own religious sites. So Al-Qarafi was saying that that's supposed to be, if the government does have the money to do so, then they should do so. That's really quite interesting. It wasn't a common idea. It wasn't a common, I guess, let's say fatwa, but of course just interesting. I don't know if this was ever applied, to be honest. I'll have to do more research, but it's important to just keep in mind when we're speaking about nonprofit organizations, and we're speaking about, let's say, religious organizations of, let's say, outside of Muslim organizations, because keep in mind that in Islam there is the system of al-waqf. What is al-waqf? Al-waqf would be any wealth that is put within a will, that this will in where it is basically assigning that this money goes to all the Muslims. So it's not necessarily for a particular group of people, but no, it's for all the Muslims. So if we're talking about perhaps building a school, that this is waqf, that this is not something that belongs to one particular person, not a particular, let's say, orphan or whatever. No, it's basically to be governed by a waqf system, which basically is to be overseen by the government. So it becomes public property, but it is dealt in a completely different system than public property that belongs to the government. So it's not government property, but it's public property that is only dedicated for whatever that waqf was basically assigning it for. All right, so someone can actually say this is waqf. This is just for the Muslims. You cannot keep it. You cannot claim control over it. It's not for the government. It's for the people. Okay, that's waqf. So the government would ensure that such awqaf, the plural of waqf, is basically, let's say, taken care of and making sure that such waqf really remains as that. And no one attempts to somehow overcome it. No one tries to somehow claim it for themselves, etc. So then in that situation, the government is basically funding the Islamic education, of course, the hospitals, etc. So what about Christian sites? They're waqf to their own group. They, you can have somebody that's a Christian say, well, I'm basically wanting this to be waqf for Christians. Okay, it's a different kind of a waqf. All right. It's basically going to be, something that only for Christians. Here it is. This, I guess, this monastery, in where it will be, of course, preserved for the Christians. So what if this place was needing renovation? Would the Muslim country actually renovate the place? It needed lights, it needed infrastructure, it needed bathrooms, etc. Does the Muslim country use, let's say, Bayt al-Mal, which is considered the Muslim treasury? Do we use that money in order to fund and simply, fund non-Muslim areas as well, or non-Muslim corporations, or let's say non-Muslim non-profit organizations? So according to Al-Qarafi, that yes, we would hold the responsibility because, hey, they're paying jizya. So the jizya goes not only for their protection, but it also goes to giving them the necessary things that they are needing, as, for example, the necessary things as a citizen. So whether we're speaking about perhaps needing government assistance, or perhaps needing healthcare, that's what the jizya is to really cover. 0.5%. It's not at all compared to what what we're paying in America. Wonder this year how much they're going to charge me for taxes for living outside of America. That'll be interesting to know. But anyhow, so does that jizya actually go in replacement for more than just protection? How far does it go? That's that area of differences of opinions. Okay, so just putting that in, keeping that in mind, and putting it, of course, within the context of how far and how, of course, and how far do we necessarily consider that governance to be stretching in? That's the part about that أعرض عنهم. You see, it's just one sentence, but then you'll have all these differences of opinions because you're looking at the application, you're looking at the implication as well, in how far can it extend, right? Okay, let's continue. وكيف يحكمونك وعندهم التوراة فيها حكم الله. And how do they كيف يحكمونك? So how do they يحكمونك actually means to put you in a position of governance, or in a position to judge between them. Can you see what I'm doing? Oh, you can't see it. Okay, here we go. All right. وكيف يحكمونك وعندهم التوراة. When they had the Torah. فيها حكم الله ثم يتولون من بعد ذلك وما أولئك بالمؤمنين. And how do they put you as the one to rule between them when they had the Torah that contained the ruling of the Lord Almighty? Yet then, thumma, the word thumma, later, they would turn away after that, and those are not the believers. One thing I really found interesting, al-Biqa'i, Tafsir al-Biqa'i, I was trying to go to different tafsir and, helping me how I can understand the context of this one, in where was it necessarily speaking in the way in where كيف يحكمونك وعندهم التوراة, is it necessarily speaking in a way where it is definitely reprimanding the Yahud? It was definitely right there, telling the Yahud in where, well, why don't you just go to the Torah? But is that really the case? Is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling them just go to the Torah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was sending the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam really as that one that was uh, abrogating all the messages, all the, let's say, the laws that were there. So how do we understand this piece of it? So al-Biqai explained, and he said what this was really right there in the context of saying, in where it was exposing the Yahud, that when they had come to you to judge and rule between them, they weren't coming in seeking the truth, because they anyways said and claimed that they had adhered to the Torah, but they didn't adhere to it. They didn't adhere to the Torah, even though they said that they had believed in it. In other words, telling the Prophet ﷺ that what they were really coming for, it wasn't to really seek a ruling. What they were really seeking was trying to seek a different way to get out of the ruling. And then therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there, telling the Prophet ﷺ, how is it that they would come asking for a ruling when the Torah itself contained the ruling of those that commit adultery and contained the ruling of those that, in the story, in the context of al-Nadir and Bani Qurayza, in where, of course, the upper class, remember, Bani Nadir were considered the upper class and didn't want to basically have the capital punishment be applied when one of Bani Nadir had killed somebody from Bani Qurayza, and Bani Qurayza were considered the lower class. So they considered that, no, why should we apply that? So that what should we do? Well, we know what the Torah is saying, but we don't want to apply it. So let's just go and find an exit to this and say, well, yeah, the government actually said that. The person that was in charge basically gave us a new ruling. So they were wanting not necessarily a ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but no, they were actually seeking a ruling that is going to be in their favor. That's what they were seeking. They were seeking a rule in their favor and not the rule based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would judge, because anyways, what the Prophet ﷺ had judged and ruled in is the same thing that what the Torah was ruling in, whether it's the stoning of those that had committed adultery or whether it is the capital punishment on the person that killed another person. But of course, يَتَوَلَّوْنَ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ. But they're living the same exact paradigm that they were always living in, which is they would know the truth, but because it wasn't in their favor, they would just turn away after that. وَمَا أُولَٰئِكَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And those are not believers. Why aren't they believers? Well, because they're not wanting to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were basically wanting to turn away from the truth. That's what they were seeking. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ. Let's look at al-Qurtubi and actually see وَكَيْفَ يُحَكِّمُونَكَ وَعِنْدَهُمُ التَّوْرَاةَ. And let's say إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التوراة فيها هدى ونور. Let's look at this ayah. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاة. So here commenting, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاة. We had revealed التوراة, and in it there was هدى ونور. There was الهدى. There was guidance and light. يحكم بها النبيون الذين أسلموا. So historically, the different prophets that had submitted to the Lord Almighty were basically ruling by the Torah. And لِلَّذِينَ هَادُوا, for those that had basically repented / the Jews, and وَالرَّبَّانِيُّونَ, and those that were adhering to the Lord Almighty, وَالْأَحْبَارِ, and even the rabbis, with what? They were ruling بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ, by what they were asked to preserve from the book of the Lord Almighty. And وَكَانُوا عَلَيْهِ شُهَدَاءَ. And they were witnesses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the truth, revealed the law in order to bring about justice. فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Then don't fear the people and fear the Lord Almighty. And do not replace or trade off my verses, that is of course, the verses, whether we're speaking about Torah or whether we're speaking about the Quran, ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا, and make a trade of course, ثَمَنًا, in where it's a value that is a small value. In other words, what is considered here بِآيَاتِ, that's basically what they're trading. They're leaving off the verses of the Lord Almighty just really for the sake of taking some, of course, interest in some money in replacement of it. And whoever does not rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, then those are the people that are kafir. How do we understand all of this? When you're looking at إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ فِيهَا هُدًى وَنُورٌ يَحْكُمُ بِهَا النَّبِيُّونَ, there is something that's really interesting here. And it was really al-Biqa'i. Where's al-Biqa'i from? Anybody know where al-Biqa'i is from? Al-Biqa'i, Sister Umayyah, you're going to answer that one. Where is she there? She is there. Sister Umayyah, where's al-Biqa'i from? It's from your country, dear. That's Lebanon. You know Lib'a'?
That's what I was going to guess. Because I
Yes.
remember you talked about him.
He's from, he was from Lebanon. All right?
Yeah.
All right? So
Yeah.
al-Biqa'i من Lib'a', من عندكم.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
al-Biqa'i was saying that this is actually considered, he's actually, you go to al-Qurtubi and not always do you see that they're saying the same thing, in where sometimes one scholar can have a lefte, or one scholar can actually have, I guess, an intuition to see one thing that another scholar did not see. And he said that there is something called al-ihtibak. What is al-ihtibak? So al-ihtibak, it's in English, they call it ellipsis, and it's basically when you would have, it's a in rhetorical and of course literary studies, in where it refers to whenever you would have a device. In other words, it's a certain word or certain sentence in context, in where certain parts of a sentence or a phrase, they're deliberately omitted but implied. Okay, and why is that always done, or when does that happen? Of course, for the sake of brevity or emphasis. And this is, what what al-Biqa'i was saying, in where the reason behind all of this, in where he said, well, inna anzalna at-Tawrah, he sees that there's this ellipsis right there, in where, yes, what it was doing, in where it was giving us the implication. What implication? It said, okay, so the ayah says, inna anzalna at-Tawrah, we had revealed the Tawrah, in where in it there was huda and nur, there was light and guidance. Okay, that's the first piece of it. Then you got يحكم بها النبيون. So that was the first thing, in where they were ruling. So that's going at the end. So يحكم is like the final thing. What were they doing? Well, they were ruling by it. Why were they ruling by it? He said, well, the prophets were ruling by that. And why were they ruling? Well, it's because they had submitted themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They submitted themselves, they became Muslim. So therefore, who was submitting themselves? Well, not number one, the prophets. Number two, of course, the Bani Israel, or at least those that were part of the Yahud. And of course, Aslamu, because even الذين هادوا, they were not Yahud to mean Jewish, but they basically had embraced the whole Tawheed idea of Islam. Let's see, والربانيون. Who are the Rabbaniyin? Rabbaniyin or Rabbaniyun are basically the ones that would adhere to Rabb, adhere to the Lord. So the ones that were basically committed and had the deep conviction to the Lord Almighty. How did you get there? So look at the word Rabb, it's right there. Okay, so Ar-Rabbaniyun, this al right there is basically this inclusive al to include those in where in Lugha Arabiya, al-Rabbani, or if you were to say, to have, let's say, a noun, and then I'm basically attributing to, it's a type of mulkiyya. Okay, it's a type of possession in where I'm adhering these people, or we're adhering these people to the Lord Almighty. What does that type of adherence actually mean? Well, that type of adherence is basically saying that these people are basically committing themselves to the Lord Almighty. They're committing themselves to the Lord Almighty, and they were called Rabbani. So Rabbaniyun wal Ahbar. Who are al-Ahbar? Al-Habr is basically the person that is basically constantly using al-Hibr, is constantly using ink. And therefore, the person al-Ahbar is not necessarily the person that's constantly using the ink, but this later became the word that defines a rabbi or a scholar. It's constantly using ink, and therefore they're basically the scholars. Okay, all right. Bima stuhfidhu. Here's the part about it. In where yahkum, how did they become? And the main implication right there, how is it implied? Was basically telling us, well, they would rule by it because they understand that it contains the guidance and it contains the light. So what do? Well, they would basically, one, they would embrace it. Two, bimastuhfidhu. Here we go. This is that part of, and piece of ihtibak right there, that part of ellipsis, and where they were basically keeping in that preservation. They knew that they were to take it seriously. They were to embrace the word of the Lord Almighty because it contains the guidance, it contains the light. Therefore, they recognize that this is something that they have to commit by, and be committed to. Who are the people that are going to do this? Well, the people that are going to be doing this and really show that commitment are really the people that are, number one, al-Nabiyun. Number two, those that were submitting themselves to the Lord Almighty from al-Ladina. So when we look at Aslamu lil-Ladina hadu, this was going to be basically saying, well, al-Ladina hadu Aslamu, al-Rabbaniyun Aslamu, al-Ahbar Aslamu, al-Nabiyun Aslamu. So this is basically right there. So we're talking about the prophets. They all submitted themselves to Islam, to Tawheed. Al-Ladina hadu, well, they were embracing Tawheed. Islam, al-Rabbaniyun, those that were considered as basically having the conviction to the Lord Almighty. What were they practicing? Aslamu, Tawheed. Al-Ahbar, the scholars, what were they practicing? The rabbis, the scholars, they were actually practicing Islam. So why were they doing all of that? بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ. They were considered as, and considering themselves, well, number one, remember when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا, who are the people that are going to be the true inheritors for the word of the Lord Almighty? Well, those that are chosen from who? From ibadina, from our servants. Those are the ones that are going to be the chosen ones. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us part of those. Every single day we're doing our tafsir, every single day. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that are al-mustafayin min al-ibad, those that are chosen from the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, استحفظوا from what? From kitabillah. وَكَانُوا عَلَيْهِ شُهَدَاء. And of course, they were witnessing. They were witnesses. They were right there. استحفظوا من كتاب الله وكانوا عليه شهداء. They were witnesses. What were they supposed to be? What does it mean to be a witness? The meaning governing as well by the words of the Lord Almighty. So what's going to happen? Well, there's going to come a time where, of course, there's going to be some trying to rule, whether it's basically some kind of a, let's say, a rich class, or some kind of maybe power that's trying to challenge the Muslim governance. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Don't fear the people. You apply the truth. Even if you were to have a political rivalry, or even if you were to have some form of, I guess, a capitalist rivalry, whatever it is, don't fear people and fear the Lord Almighty. Support the truth, support guidance, support light, support the revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed throughout time, in where whether it was the light in the Torah or the light of the last revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had later revealed with the Prophet Prophet Muhammad, because the Torah itself was actually pushing us to embrace the Prophet and embrace what was sent onto the Quran. وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بآياتي ثمنا قليلا. What is ولا تشتروا? ولا تشتروا بآياتي ثمنا قليلا, and where don't buy and replace. So when we say ولا تشتروا, what does that mean? So تشتري something is to trade. When you're trading, you're basically considering giving away on something, giving up on something in replacement for something else. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying, well, this ba tadkhul ala al-matruk. What did they leave? Well, they basically left al-ayat. They basically left the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what did they get instead of it? What were they really seeking? Well, they were wanting thamanan qalila, a little pay in replacement. So to them, they're willing to give up. When you look at وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا, is this necessarily talking about the actual book when I'm basically buying the book itself? No, this is not talking about the actual book, but this is talking about the Sharia itself, in where someone can probably bribe you to not apply Islam, or bribe you, or push, of course, politically, or push towards leaving the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course give you probably some form of financing, some form of thamanan qalila without you realizing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says at the final thing, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Whoever does not rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then those are the people that are considered the disbelievers. And of course, we do see that we'll talk about, is it فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ? What about today? The Muslim countries, the presidents in those Muslim countries, are they kafir? How do we understand that? If فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ, is there a level of kufr and kufr? What if I basically needed to sue someone because they're harming me? Can I actually go to, the civil court and go to, the American court or whatever, because that's the only court there is? Would I be considered a kafir? How do we understand all of that? So this is what we're going to talk about, inshallah, next time. And subhanakallahumma bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to listen to them. I know we kind of went, left and right, and we went to Russia, we went back to Africa, then we went to Latin America, then Australia, and then we came back to our Malaysia. But if there are any questions, or if there's any question, I'd be happy to answer it. Or even a comment. Don't take us to Russia next time. That's okay. Noor, are you still there? Sister Umayya, you still there? Mumtahina is there. We'll provoke her somehow. And
Yes,
Sister,
we're still here.
there you go. And Aysha, mashallah, and Zaboon. So this is it, inshallah. I guess everyone is not wanting to be on. We're stopping the live stream, and then we're stopping the recording. Let's see, how do we stop the recording?